Welcome to Euroz Hartleys Finding the Front, where we get to know the people who front some of Western Australia's leading companies, providing you with real insights into the way they think and approach things, both in business and in life. So get the volume adjusted in your car or your headphones sorted and settle in for a great story. Here's your host, Tim Banfield.
Hey everyone, and welcome along to our latest episode of Euroz Hartleys Finding the Front. For those of you who are listening in for the first time, Euroz Hartleys is a proudly Western Australian leading financial services company. We specialise in the provision of wealth management, stockbroking, corporate finance, institutional sales and targeted research services. If you'd like to learn more about Euroz Hartleys and the services we provide, please do not hesitate to contact us or visit our website at www.eurozhartleys.com. Our special guest for this episode is 30-year veteran and leader in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry, Dr. Nina Webster. Nina is the CEO and Managing Director of clinical stage biopharmaceutical company Dimerix, stock code DXB. This company, under Nina's leadership and guidance, is working to improve the lives of patients globally with inflammatory diseases including both kidney and respiratory. This is fascinating and such a wonderful insight into Nina's background growing up in the UK, getting a start as a trainee lab technician, moving to Australia to what she does now. There are so many takeaways from her journey, but also the journey of a biopharmaceutical company. It is clear Nina certainly loves what she does. So without further ado, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to Euroz Hartleys Finding the Front, the CEO and Managing Director of Dimerix, an all-round great person, Dr. Nina Webster. Hi Nina, and welcome to Euroz Hartleys Finding the Front. Thanks a lot for taking the time out. It's really particularly important given you've just flown in from Melbourne and taken a bit of your valuable time out to join us. So look, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Look, Nina, it's so clear from all the research I've done, you've had a wonderful career in pharmaceuticals and biotech, and it's something you're passionate about. But before we get into it, I just wanted to spend a bit of time, as we do with our podcast Finding the Front, learning a little bit about your background and how you got there in the first place and how you established your career. And one of the fascinating things that I found out as I was doing my research is that you grew up in a tiny village called Portchester in the United Kingdom.
I did. Portchester is a relatively small village and it has a Roman castle built in 400 AD, so that's history for you.
Wow. And how did you find it? Did you love it?
We did. I mean, we grew up riding our bikes up and down the moat and crab fishing around the fort there. You could find various bones and skeletons over the years from the various wars that the UK had been in. So, yeah, it was a lot of history.
And Portchester, is that on the coast?
It is. It's right on the south coast. So you think of England as a triangle, big triangle. It's in the middle on the bottom.
Right, okay. I noticed that you're one of 4 children, 4 girls.
I am one of 4 girls, no brothers.
Yeah. Do you have a lot of fun?
We did have a lot of fun. I was clearly the tomboy of the family, though. Growing up, the soccer player, I had the train set. In fact, I wanted to be a stunt woman when I wanted to grow up. So I used to ride my BMX bike and built ramps, etc., around our area.
Yeah. And what about your sisters?
Completely different. We were really fortunate. We had parents who encouraged us all to follow our own path. And so all uniquely different careers, different backgrounds, different interests. Right. But we're all very close as a family.
Yeah, fantastic. What did your parents do in Portchester?
So my father was a local government officer working for community centres around the area, and my mother was a full-time mother until I was 12, and then she went back into real estate.
Is that right? Real estate, was that something she had a passion about, or is it just sort of fell into it?
Kind of fell into it. She was originally a secretary for a company who ran convenience stores. And above the convenience stores, they used to rent out the areas for residential accommodation. And so she started taking over that for the convenience store and looking after the rentals of those accommodations above the shop. And through that, she learned very much about that industry and started her own business in real estate.
She sounds quite entrepreneurial.
She was.
Yeah. I look at the background of your mum and dad, and Was there any link here growing up to biotech, pharmaceutical, health, anything like that?
Not at all. In fact, I'm the first one in our family to ever go to university.
Right. Wow. That's really something. When you look at your schooling, though, you went to school within Port Chester. Was it just a normal primary school?
It was a very small primary school, so our class size would have been about 10, 11 people.
10 or 11 people, right. And then you went to secondary school up the road or the same college?
To Fareham, so it was the next town over, so a town rather than a village.
Yes.
So slightly bigger, and all of a sudden that was a very different exposure, very different context with the number of students there.
Student size double?
More than doubled. I think it was 3 or 4 times the size.
Oh, right. Okay. Nina, did you love school? Did you get involved with it? You're clearly bright. Did you perform well?
I did love school. School was a passion for me. I was in a lot of the school sports teams. I was very fortunate. I was captain of the hockey team. I played state hockey, or the equivalent of state hockey in the UK, and was also one of the prefects for the school, which isn't going to surprise people who know me.
Really? I was actually looking through, you do love your sport. Goodness me. You were hockey, you did soccer. You're in you're in the under-18 soccer team for Portsmouth ladies.
Yes, Portsmouth ladies. We did a lot of international matches as well.
Right, international.
Yeah.
Do you still love your soccer?
Not so much now. I haven't had time to play that for many years, actually. And the same with hockey. I took up other sports that I could take the family with me on, such as skiing and originally scuba.
Right. Do you have a soccer team you follow, though, in the UK?
Well, I have to say I'm a Pompey lass by heart, so Portsmouth is still the team that we would follow.
Right, okay.
But tend to follow more rugby. Since I spent some time in Wales, we really got into the rugby side. Rugby union, not rugby league.
Right, okay.
And so we do have season tickets to follow that.
I noticed that you enjoyed scuba. What did you enjoy about that? Literally the tranquility of being underwater?
That's exactly right. And I took that up when I went to university for my PhD. And it was an opportunity because I was one of the more mature students as a PhD student, meant that I became a scuba instructor. And what I found and what I love about scuba is that you really are at peace. Once you go down under that water, you can forget all your worries in the world. It's just you, the bubbles around you, and you can pretty much guarantee you're probably the only person to see that on that day. And it's such a nice feeling.
Yes. No, I can totally appreciate that. Okay, so the question that we often ask is, you're at school, did you know what you wanted to be as you grew up? And this is quite interesting that you're one of the only person in your family that actually went on to university and tertiary education. Did you know what you wanted to do? Did you have an inkling?
Well, not at all, actually. Not in terms of where I was going to end up, that's for sure. So when I was finishing school at 18, I decided I wanted to be a paramedic. Unfortunately, I was too young to drive the ambulances. In the UK, you had to be 21 at the time. So instead, I decided to get a filler job and go and be a lab technician for a large pharmaceutical company in the south coast of England, just until I was 21.
So you could drive the ambulance?
And so I could drive the ambulance, that's right.
And that's how it started?
And that is how it started.
So you started, as you've said previously when we were chatting, you started really at the ground floor as a part-time role, looking as a filler job before you could drive the ambulance.
I was the trainee lab technician, so the lowest job within the laboratory. It was a full-time role, but fortunately for me, with the company was a company called Ledley Cyanamid, became Wyeth and now part of Pfizer. And the great thing for me at that time is that they had this policy where they would train you in any subject relevant to the company. So they sponsored me for my pharmacology degree. So I actually did my pharmacology degree 1 day a week. I worked full time. I had to work extra hours on those other days in the office to make up the time. But they fully paid for that degree and also did my honours project as part of work as well.
That's fantastic. Did you have time off after school? Or this was part of it, straight into it?
Straight into it, yeah, that's right. And I think, the advantage was, though, is there was so much prior learning as part of that work. So some of the units, they actually counted those as prior learning at work through that degree process. So a great opportunity, because the role I had originally as trainee lab technician, as I finished my pharmacology degree, they moved me into new product development area. And that meant I got exposure to the new inventions, formulation development, stability, which is basically shelf life of a product, making sure that it's stable in its packaging, etc. And what we call technology transfer. And what that means is when you've got a new concept, you're building it at the bench. You need to be able to demonstrate you can do that on a commercial scale, on a much bigger scale. Is it scalable?
Yes.
So part of my role at that point was to spend a day in the full manufacturing suite overseeing technology transfer for commercial scale, or spending a day on the packaging line and actually making sure that troubleshooting anything that in that process. So that was a great exposure because you really went from start to finish on the whole pharmaceutical process.
You became a jack of all trades across that process, and
master of none.
Master of none. Well, I mean, at that age, you don't expect it to be, but what a foundation.
It was a great exposure. But I hit this point where I had to go and talk to my boss because I was doing this role, and I said, well, why can't I get the title and the salary? And they said, because you haven't got a PhD. So I thought, I will go and get a PhD then.
So for the listener, just to brief you in this educational pursuit, Nina came out and she did a Bachelor of Science. She achieved honours in pharmacology. Then she went on and did a Doctor of Philosophy in pharmaceutics, drug delivery, which in the transdermal field. Now, you became a doctor, basically, at the end of this, in your chosen field of pharmaceutics, drug delivery. But what is transdermal? Can you just bring that all together? And in light of what you said to your boss, well, I need that PhD. Well, he said, you need that PhD to advance. And how did that unfold?
Yeah, so I thought, why not? I'll go and get that PhD. So I went off to Cardiff University to study my PhD in transdermal drug delivery, which is the delivery of drugs through skin.
Right.
That was a 3-year course, and what was interesting during that process is because and despite all my qualifications, that's the only time I was a full-time student. Every other course I've done while working full-time. But to support myself doing my PhD, I was a bus driver. So that was a very different exposure to life, to seeing all walks of life in that.
Gosh.
That's a different discussion.
What were you bus driving for?
Just around the Cardiff routes. So, it'd be...
Yep.
Taking passengers, dropping them off on the route, going round and round and round Cardiff for a few hours every couple of days, and that just gave me enough to make sure I could cover all my cost of living while doing my PhD.
Okay, so then you went on to do a Master of Intellectual Property Law. So the education continued.
It did, but what happened there is when I finished my PhD in transdermal drug delivery, I was actually very fortunate. Wyeth did offer me that promotion. But at the same time, I'd been offered a 1-year role out here in Australia. And I thought a 1-year holiday in Australia sounded amazing. So I came out here with my one suitcase in hand to start with a company called Acrux. And Acrux is a Melbourne-based ASX-listed company specialising in transdermal drug delivery. So my PhD very much suited that role.
It's almost like the perfect opportunity.
It was the perfect opportunity. And I was originally the senior scientist where I was the inventor for one of their products that did actually get commercialised globally. Now, during that process, I went from senior scientist, I was project manager during phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials. Those are the earlier studies in humans. And at that point, I was moved to the intellectual property manager. And I went to my boss and had another conversation to say, well, I'm now responsible for the IP in this company. Can I get some training? And they said, yeah, that's a really good idea. So they sponsored me for my master's in intellectual property law, and I specialised in contract law, which is very, very handy when I'm doing a lot of the negotiation in licensing.
Yes, I can see where that's heading. So that's in 2001 when you moved to Australia. Okay. And I just want to ask, transdermal, what was it about transdermal that really got your interest? Was it a passion? Like, did you think, this really makes sense?
I think drug delivery generally made sense to me. Having done the pharmacology background, the work I was doing with Wyeth at the time, there were a number of topical formulations. So topical, again, means the creams, gels, ointments, etc.
Yeah.
So understanding how that worked through skin, which was quite unique at the time, was really appealing to me. And having that specialty is actually a really big advantage in coming out to Australia, because it meant that really there was nobody here who could do what I was doing.
Is that right? Okay, and then you've overlaid that foundation or the science with a corporate overlaid with the intellectual property law and the contracts, which is quite an interesting combination.
It was, and it was that combination of having the technology background as well as the intellectual property law background is what brought me into business development. So I moved into business development at that point, and that was because I could bring the technology and the patents and trademarks all together to talk with potential partners, and moved into licensing transactions.
So this brings you to working for a company called Acrux, and Acrux as a director for business development. So you've come from that intellectual property side, and now you're into business development, where you've talked about what you're doing there. But let's just explore that role a little bit, because what we're doing here is laying the foundation for where you are now and the multitude of roles you do within Dimerix, the company you're CEO and managing director of now. But what you've learned here is really crucial.
Absolutely. So during that process as the business development director, that was the partnering, so identifying potential partners around the world, discussing with those potential partners, negotiating, contracting with those partners, and ultimately being the strategic alliance manager, so actually managing the relationship as well. So that's given me a not just the process of going through that and that real understanding of contracting and negotiating with those parties, but I think, it's also given me a lot of those key contacts. So in most of those companies around the world, I have a reasonably good contact with the key players in those companies, which again puts me in very good stead for where I am today.
Nina, if we could just put this into context from the biopharmaceutical industry per se, right? Your role is, in this case, you're working for a company that has technology, that has patents, that has intellectual property, and you're looking to align yourself with partners to either further that development or have a licensing arrangement or a distribution arrangement where they can take that to their countries in particular parts of the world. Is that what you were doing really when you talk about this, in the context of simple business knowledge?
In summary, yes. The process is that the company Acrux at the time was very capable of delivering on the clinical trials, including a phase 3 clinical trial. And phase 3, for context, is the last study before going to market.
Right.
So the company was capable of doing all of that process. But what we were looking for was a partner that could do the sales and marketing. And that meant that then they have the sales force, they go out, sell the product, and the royalties on that product, so a percentage of any of those sales come back to Acrux. And that's the process that took.
Were they delivering technology that was transdermal?
Yes, so in fact, it was a product that I was the originally inventor of. So I was the inventor of Axiron. There's a product called Axiron. It was a hormonal gel for men.
Right.
And I was then the IP manager, prosecuted the patents, and then I was the business development director and did the deal. So I actually followed that product all the way through from inception and patent all the way through to licensing and global commercialization.
You were with Acrux in this, what was a transforming role for some 10 years.
Almost 10 years. And during that process, there was another discussion, it's going to see a trend here, another discussion with my manager talking about particular salary structures and promotions at that time, and they identified that I did not have an MBA. And so I negotiated that they sponsored me for my MBA. So another thing that I did while working at Acrux is I got my MBA as well. And so that I got the science, business and law. So it meant that one of my key competencies is to translate between business, science and law and back again between those three different things. Now, during that almost 10 years, I actually had my first child during that period as well. But at the end of it, we just signed the biggest deal in the history of Australian biotech at the time. The product had just been approved by the FDA, riding at an all-time career high. And then they made half the company redundant overnight, including me. Now, I have to say that was one of the biggest shocks I've ever faced. Did not see that coming. And much as I know it's not personal, it was always a business decision. That hurt.
Yes. Just tell us about that because, well, for the listener, to have something approved by the FDA is the Food and Drug Authority in the US. So it's a huge, huge moment for any company to have that approval go through. You drove it. Particularly it was your sort of baby in terms of your invention and the way you've gone about it. Must have been extraordinarily disappointing for them to say, thanks a lot.
It was at the time, and I have to think at the time I thought it was the worst thing that could have ever happened to me. I thought, what do I do now? I don't know anything else. But I actually think, the hindsight is it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yes.
Because it made me stretch outside of my comfort zone. It made me think about all of those other skill sets that I have and the experience I've picked up along those ways. So I spent the next 5 weeks having many, many coffees.
Yes.
And I then landed the role as the commercialisation director at another ASX-listed company called Immuron, and they're working in polyclonal antibodies, so a very different asset. But that meant doing licensing transactions for them as well.
Wow. So just back a step, polyclonal antibodies.
Yes.
Can you just explain what that's about?
So antibodies is to fight infection, essentially, and polyclonal just means there's many different sides to that, if you like, in simple terms. And so the product specifically that we were working on with Immuron at the time is a product called Travelan, and it's against essentially food poisoning when you go overseas.
Very valuable.
It is.
And how did this go?
Well, it was awesome. I mean, the product was well underway when I joined the team. I was looking after capital raising, so I had my first foray into investor relations at the time as well.
Yes.
As well as the licensing and transactions. So we actually did a number of different licensing deals overseas for Travelan as well.
Again, there's a similar theme here, but you're looking at the company's negotiations, the contractual nature, the intellectual property.
Intellectual property, yes, as well as the background science.
And then the capital raising on top, which is the added first foray into, which is another skill set you've picked up.
Yes, a new exposure.
New exposure. What did you enjoy about that the most, that role?
I think speaking with people, one of the things that I enjoy, and it's a bit of ironic really, people see me present a lot on stage and actually that's not my comfort zone.
Right.
I like the boardroom. Those discussions, those Q&A sessions, due diligence. I find due diligence absolutely fascinating. Bring on your questions. It's a really good process for me, and that one that I've always had good fun doing, but also had a team that are very supportive in that as well. So when we talk about me and the successes that I've had, really I do want to just acknowledge that this is about a team effort. It's never just one person that can do all this stuff.
Yes.
And, when I look in the context of Acrux back in that day and the Dimerix team that we have now, we've got phenomenal teams. I'm surrounded by some very smart people.
Well, that does bring me to leadership. And you did go from Immuron back to Acrux, and it rounds out before you went on to Dimerix.
Yeah, that's right. So I was invited to come back after almost 2 years with Immuron, and I should actually say 12 months of which I was working from home after the birth of my second child. I then was invited to come back to Acrux, and this time as the commercialisation director at Acrux, looking after investor relations, business development, strategic alliances, intellectual property, but also all of the legal matters, because they did go through a few different what they call paragraph 4 patent litigations, and that's where a generic product challenges your patent and tries to get on market. So it had a exposure through the US litigation system on that too.
Well, firstly, the fact that Acrux sought you out to bring you back after they'd let you go was a bit of a feather in your cap. So you clearly went out there and improved your skill set and became almost too valuable not to really get back onto the Acrux team. And that must have been quite an interesting period of time in that respect.
It was very satisfying. And I think the other component, though, was where it fit within my career and my life at that time. So I should probably mention, for about 9 years, I worked 3 days a week. So for some of this period, through those Immuron days and those Acrux days, I was part-time, balancing the life of the 2 children.
Yes.
And it was always the standard thing of children go to sleep, laptop comes out, children wake up, laptop goes away. And that's the process we went through.
And how did you find that, Nina?
A juggle. But, I've never been one to sit still. You can probably tell from even those early days with the sporting activities. So for me, keeping active, keeping busy. And I think what's really worked for me is that it's kept my foot on the corporate ladder. So it meant that when I did sort of get to the point where my youngest started school and I was ready to come back full time, taking on CEO, managing director full time, it was a bit of a double whammy. But it was a good time for me because the 2 were at school then and I was ready to go, having stayed in that corporate ladder.
Well, with regards to Acrux, and I just want to sort of look at this in terms of some of the highlights that came out of that. You led multiple negotiations. You've got the interactions, which we talked about earlier with the FDA and other regulators, and your due diligence on licensing and how to formulate licensing agreements for distribution. Part of my understanding with regards to biotech, biopharmaceutical companies is patents have a huge role to play in terms of your patent family and the duration of those patents and how long they go for, so that your generic drugs and that sort of thing pose less of a risk. Could you give us a bit of an insight into that with what you learned up until this point?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things I'd probably point out is, first of all, yes, you absolutely look at what we call the patent fencing strategy. And so you have your core product, has the patent on it, and then you start building out almost like a castle defense system. You build out rings around that core patent so that you're trying to create as many barriers to those generic entries as you can. But it's always a challenge, particularly in the US, because the way that most of these generic companies look at it these days is that it's not a case of if you will be challenged, it'll be when you be challenged if you get to market. And this is why things like exclusivity become so important. And this is something probably is quite important for listeners to understand as well. Everyone talks about how important what we call composition of matter patents are. And that means the patent of the actual active ingredient. Now, a lot of time, by the time you get to market, they've expired. But the key thing with potential partners and the discussions we have with potential partners is it's the exclusivity that's far more valuable. Now, exclusivity means the number of years where a generic cannot challenge your patent and cannot enter the market. So it's a guaranteed exclusivity period, and partners, that is what they're looking for.
Regardless of the patent expiry?
Regardless of the patent expiry.
How do you come up with the exclusivity outside of the patent?
So exclusivity happens when it's the first time that that active ingredient has been approved in that territory, in that country. And so in the US, for example, with Dimerix, we have what's called an orphan drug being developed, and that means it's a rare type of disease. And with that, you get 7 years exclusivity in the US and 10 years in Europe. For a standard branded drug, not an orphan disease, not a rare disease, it's 5 years in the US. But that's, again, 5 years guaranteed that you cannot have your patent challenged or a generic enter the market.
Let's use that as an example. If you've got 7 years on exclusivity, how long would the patent usually run for?
Now, the patent runs longer. So in the instance of our product at the moment with Dimerix is that we have patents granted to 2032 and we have patent applications to 2042 if granted. But the exclusivity just means that it's the period as soon as we hit market, the first 7 years in the US, 10 years in Europe, that those patents cannot be challenged. And the reason that's important is it guarantees that your licensing partner has that period to make their money before they get challenged.
So it's crucial in terms of the licensing agreements in place that the patent and exclusivity, more the exclusivity, is giving them enough runway to generate that return.
They work together, and that's exactly right, is giving them a runway to get that return.
Thanks for sharing. This is fascinating. So when you came out of Acrux, you had all this track record behind you, understanding that sort of thing. What prompted you to move, family aside, because I understand circumstances change with regards to the kid's age and heading off to school, but when you were going to jump ship from Acrux, what was your idea on a successful biotech or biopharmaceutical company? What were you looking for, or were you approached? How did this unfold? And I think for the listeners, the key is what a biotech or biopharmaceutical company is endeavouring to achieve, both from having an impact on human life, but also commercially, and how that unfolds to make it ideal for a person like you to enter.
Yeah, so what brought me to Dimerix, it was kind of a bit of both of I was ready to take that next step. You think about all of the background that we've been discussing today, it was time to bring all of that together into a CEO role. So I'd done each of the individual pieces, now it's time to put them all together. In terms of Dimerix and why Dimerix specifically, and this is where biopharmaceutical companies or pharmaceutical companies in general go through a bit of an evolution process. So when they first start up, it's very much about the science. It's all science-driven. Does it even work? And so the team that you have involved are very much the scientific staff, and they do a great job at bringing it through to prove the concept. But you then hit this point where you need to transition from an R&D company into a commercial company. Now, an example with Dimerix is when I joined in 2018, they were still hand-filling capsules at a bench with a prototype formulation. It was not scalable. You would never be able to use that formulation running hundreds of capsules a minute on a machine.
Yes.
So we had to then step back and turn that into something that was commercial. And so it's a recognition in companies that when you take that transition, you need a different team. You need different skill sets to be able to plug all of those gaps for commercialization. So that was where I felt that I could add real value to Dimerix, was recognizing where those gaps were, bringing the right people in to fill those gaps, and actually making sure that we had a product, not just an R&D concept, but we have a product that is sellable. So when I came into Dimerix, the remit I was given was I needed to take this prototype formulation, turn that into something that was commercially scalable. We had to plug all of those technical gaps to make sure that we had shelf life on the product with a finished formulation. We had all of our container closures. We call it container closure. It means whether it's in a bottle or in a blister pack or whatever the container you put it in. We had to make sure that we had all of the non-clinical done. So all of your safety, all of your toxicology is all done as well. And then that is what we said we needed to achieve to be able to get to partnering. So I actually talked about this when I joined in 2018, 2019 and said, right, if we want to do partnering, and this is in public domain presentations I gave at the time,
Yes.
and said for us to achieve this, we need to do A, B, C, D, and E. And what was really satisfying this year is I actually presented at a conference actually in Fremantle a couple of weeks ago where I showed that slide and said, and we did A, B, C, D, and E, and we got licensing deals. And so that was very much a very satisfying moment. It's taken, 6 years to tick all of those boxes, but this is what it leads to.
It sounds like a long process in that regard, but then it's quite quick in many other ways. For the listener, it's really interesting to know how you got to these points.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I mean, the Dimerix itself was founded on a platform technology. So there's actually a platform that sits behind this that could be applicable to a number of different products. Now, DMX200 is our lead asset, and one of the things that I identified, and I've seen at other companies through my career as well, is that having a big pipeline is not always beneficial because most of us run on the smell of an oily rag with funding.
Yes.
And so having a big pipeline, you don't have the money or the people to deliver on that. So what we had determined is we have others trickling in behind, but we have to focus on our lead asset. We have to prove that concept before we do other things and diversify the spend of our money and the distraction of our resources. So we focused on DMX200 in a disease called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. I won't necessarily ask you to repeat that. FSGS. It's a rare type of kidney disease. And why is that important? One, it's a really good sweet spot for how our mechanism of action works. Essentially, what we're trying to do is drive down inflammation. It prevents scarring and fibrosis in the kidney, and therefore it prevents the loss of the cells that actually help the kidney to function.
Just pause there. Kidney disease is, well, I read in one of your presentations, kidney disease is the third fastest growing cause of death globally.
Correct.
Now, was that a driving force when you took this role on, that you could see you could make an impact on kidney disease and in turn respiratory disease?
The short answer is yes. I mean, FSGS in particular is a very high unmet need. Now, we talk about it being a rare disease, orphan disease. It's not ultra rare. There's actually a really good number of patients around the world, and sadly it affects children down from 2 years old all the way to adult. With this particular disease, once they get diagnosed, to kidney failure is typically less than 5 years, so it's really aggressive.
Right.
If they get a transplant, 60% get reoccurring FSGS in the transplanted kidney. So that's not an answer either. So to your point, absolutely, there's a very high unmet need here for these patients in such a fast-growing opportunity.
Yes. And DMX200 is the ingredient that can allow Dimerix to grow a solution.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is DMX200, it works, as I mentioned, on that inflammatory pathway. Yes. And so we'll ultimately have a product that can help buy time for these patients. Now, ultimately, what this means is that kidney function declines naturally as we age. It declines for all of us. But typically, we will be long gone before we ever hit the point of kidney failure. For these FSGS patients, that kidney function is crashing really quickly.
Yes.
So what we want to do with a product like DMX200 is move that line. Now, even if we only move it a bit, that's years on the life of a kidney. Move it a lot, that's even more. Now, you can never regain the function of the kidney that's gone because these cells can't regenerate. Once the kidney's gone, it's gone. That's why it's progressive. But if we can slow down the rate of kidney disease progression and buy these patient years, that is a quality of life that they do not have to be on dialysis.
Yes.
There's a cost to the healthcare system. You think of 2023, it cost the US healthcare system $130 billion US dollars on kidney disease, and the majority of that is on dialysis. So anything we can do to reduce that burden, help improve quality of life, is going to be a great outcome.
It all makes a lot of sense. So you've clearly taken this, and then where are we at in terms of its development? Because we talked about earlier in the discussion around the FDA and other regulators, so the FDA, the Food and Drug Authority in the US and other regulators. How is it being received in terms of, clearly there's an urgency to get something that can have an impact like DMX 200 out available to the everyday person to use. Where are we at in the whole cycle?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And if you think of the metrics in the US, for example, from 2001 to 2023, the number of patients with kidney failure has doubled. So it is a huge, huge problem around the world. Now, one of the challenges with kidney disease historically, and the reason there was little or no innovation for over 20 years, was because kidney trials had to run to what they call hard renal endpoints. And basically what that means is a kidney trial had to run until the patient died or the kidney failed. That could take years, decades. So in around 2018, 2019, a number of the regulators got together with some of the national bodies and determined we could use what we call surrogate endpoints. So that means it's an alternative endpoint that we can use as a marker of what is happening in the background to improve kidney health. And so in our case, they agreed that we could use protein in the urine, we call that proteinuria, and what we call eGFR, so estimated glomerular filtration rate. And again, that's just how many mils per minute per year your kidney is filtering. Those measures can be measured in months and years, not decades. So all of a sudden, these trials are quite manageable, and that is where we find ourselves today, is that we can, as Dimerix, manage a phase 3 clinical trial, last trial before market, in this particular disease, and not just manage that trial, but actually have interim analysis built into it as well, where there could be an opportunity for early access to market because it's such a high unmet need.
The trials, are they occurring all over the world?
The trial is running in 19 different countries around the world in 170 clinical sites. So it's a big study. Now, what this does mean is that we have engaged with 19 different regulatory agencies around the world as well. The reason that is so important is that we have already had those discussions that says that not just is this trial relevant for US FDA and for the European EMA regulatory agencies, but also could be approvable in China with the NMPA, where the FDA equivalent in China, and the other 18 countries that we've been out to as well.
Nina, from the surface, when you look at this, you think, right, okay, have you got any competitors or competing tech advancements that would be able to provide a solution like what Dimerix is proposing?
And this is where we have a huge advantage. So at the moment, there is nothing approved for FSGS anywhere in the world. And we are the only candidate in a phase 3 clinical trial. So there's nothing else close to us either. Now, of course, there are others looking at FSGS in earlier stage, so what we call a phase 2A trial, so much earlier stage. So a couple of different points with that. First of all, they're a number of years behind us, so we certainly have the first mover advantage there as well. But the second component is the mechanism of action that these other products are using are not competing with what we're trying to do. And as such, even if they did get to market, could be complementary rather than competitive.
The size and scale of this phase 3, and look, I think for the listener, can you just go through what phase 3 actually means? You said prior it goes to market, which is prior to actually delivering to humans, in essence, in an open and transparent way through distribution methods. But clearly you're delivering to humans in a phase 3 trial environment, which is what they call clinical trial. Can you just go back through, in brief, what the previous phases have been to get to that point?
Yeah, so typically in a drug development process, you have what we call preclinical. So you have to demonstrate that either in the laboratory or in an animal model that something's going to work to make sure it's safe. You then go into what we call a phase 1 clinical trial. A phase 1 clinical trial is typically in healthy volunteers, so they don't have the disease. But what you're looking at there is safety and what we call pharmacokinetics. So that's basically how much of the drug is in your blood. So you just take blood samples and measure what's in the blood. Then you go into a phase 2. You can have two different types of phase 2, 2A and 2B. Essentially, a phase 2 is looking at safety first, but secondary, because it's actually in the patient with the disease, you can actually then get the efficacy measures as well. So phase 2, you get efficacy model out. And then if all of those are successful, you can then look at going into a phase 3 clinical trial, which is the last one and largest one around the world. So one of the advantages we have is that when you look at a phase 1 or phase 2, there's a lot of risk in that, because does it work? Is it safe? Have you got the right measure of a dose of the drug? You have to do what we call dose escalation, make sure you got the right dose. All of those things add risk into a study. By the time we get to phase 3, is there risk? Of course there's risk. It's why we have to do a clinical trial. But the risk is significantly reduced because you've already shown safety, you've already shown efficacy, and now you have to replicate that in a much bigger cohort around the world.
That's the size of the trial.
That's the size of the trial.
Yes, okay. And when do the results come out for these trials? Like, it's that big. Does it take forever?
No, so this is one of the advantages we have. Now, the full study is a 2-year study looking at that kidney function, ultimately. But because we have orphan drug designation, because we are a rare disease with this high unmet need, we've got 2 interim analyses built in. Now, the first of those analyses actually happened in March, just gone. And that's where we looked at protein in the urine. Protein in the urine tells us how fast is your kidney disease failing. If you can reduce the amount of protein in the urine, it says you're slowing down kidney disease progression.
Okay.
That was successful. And so we hit all of the endpoints that we wanted to hit in March, and says we keep going. The next interim analysis is the one that's really interesting, because that is looking at both protein in the urine, but also that glomerular filtration rate, so the kidney function. If that data is compelling, we may be able to take that to a regulator and get early marketing. Now, the study still has to continue in the background to full endpoint, but you could be on market at that point halfway through the study because it's such a high unmet need. Now, based on current recruitment rates, we would expect that outcome to be middle of next year, 2025 calendar year.
Okay, right. Just coming back to you, Nina, this is all, so interesting. Coming back to you, how have you found it with regards to plotting the course, bringing in the people? You know, you've clearly got a team behind you now that is substantial but also highly credible. Tell us a little bit about it and how you're finding it, leading this team.
So I think a couple of different things there. This industry is a roller coaster. It always is.
Right.
And, there's no such thing as a straightforward get from A to B. There's always a few wobbles, roadblocks, little bumps, speed bumps along the way. And that's what we are. We're a team of problem solvers. And we get ourselves over those humps and onto the next challenge. So that is constantly what we're doing. And to your point, I've surrounded myself with some very smart people. What is interesting, when you think of the earlier discussion we had on my career with Acrux, I actually have some of that successful team with me at Dimerix. So again, a team that has done it before in their specialty areas. I recognise, that, and we made this point, I think, at the start, I'm that jack of all trades, master of none. I can essentially look at things and know something's missing. Don't necessarily know how to do it, but I know what's missing.
Yes.
But I also know who can do that. And so it's bringing in the right skills to do that. So when I get to talk about the successes of the company and my success, it's actually because of the team. So it's their success is my success.
Do you enjoy that part of it, the team?
I do. We've got a great team. And I think, this is where you've got to be able to enjoy working with each other. You've got to have a sense of humour. And you have to be able to compartmentalise. I think that's one of the things I'd probably say is, particularly in an ASX-listed company, there are moments where shareholders can be pretty rude to you.
Yes.
And you have to be able to take that, but not take it home and certainly not take it out on the family. And so that was something I learned pretty early on, is to compartmentalise and make sure that the challenges stay at the office.
Yes, I totally understand. It's very interesting when you look at how that team's evolved and what you've been able to achieve. I think the other part of this that's really stands out when you look at what you've achieved with Dimerix and what you were able to learn through Acrux through that period of time, and with the Immuron time as well, is licensing. Now, one of the things that you've done at Dimerix is you've inked some pretty big licensing deals, right? And I put that into context. We've talked about DMX 200, the essential ingredient. We've talked about patents. We've talked about intellectual property. We've talked about putting a team together. We've talked about getting approval and the phases to get to approval to be able to distribute. This licensing part comes back to that last bit, the distribution. If it's successful, how's it going to get out around the world to everyone who needs it? Tell us a little bit about that, because it's a real important skill set you've picked up along your journey.
Yeah, and to your point, this is one of the key things that we're looking for, is to try and get DMX 200 into as many FSGS patients' hands as we can. Now, sadly, again, this is a disease that affects per capita pretty much even around the world. And so it's something where we want to get it into as many hands as we can. Now, that's obviously beneficial to the patient, and that's what the ultimate aim here. But it's also beneficial to us and our shareholders, because every sale there is a royalty back to the company as well. Now, one thing I've learned over my career is that there are no two negotiations ever the same. So it's not like you can sit somebody in the room and teach them how to do a deal. It's a little bit about the feel, the discussion, the negotiation and the process. But one of the key things I'd probably highlight is it's about the setup for it as well. And so not just in terms of, talking about you need to make sure you've done the trials or you've got your commercial scale up. I'm talking about your partnering package. So we have a partnering plan, we have a business plan, we have a business case, we have our confidential information memorandum, we have our data room set up ready to go, which is an electronic data room, got all of the information in there that's confidential that a partner can come in and have a look at. They want to go through every drawer. They want to have a look under every little stone that we have. And so that process is having it all set up and ready to go is absolutely key. And so for us, it was having the process in place, but having a team that have done it before as well in that due diligence. Again, I would highlight, don't underestimate how much time it takes to do due diligence. The questions that come in from these companies are deep.
Just pause there. You say partner in the companies that want to do the DD. The typical partner would be a large pharma company, a large pharmaceutical company, or what's the typical suitor?
It could be. And then again, this is where it's interesting, and it differs depending on which indication you're going after. Now, in the case of FSGS being a type of kidney disease, but also being a rare disease, we've actually got a bigger pool of potential suitors. So to your point, yes, Big Pharma is there because Big Pharma often have rare disease divisions, but also we've got the specialty kidney companies, we've got the specialty rare disease companies, and we've got the specialty rare disease kidney companies. And so our pool, if you like, is a little bit bigger than some of the others where they might only have a limited number of potential partners. And so an example would be the two deals that we did recently in the last 12 months. The first one was with a company called Advanced Pharma for Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. That one just by itself was up to $230 million plus royalties. And, when we think about that particular deal, we kissed a lot of frogs. We don't just go with one partner. You have to have a little bit of competitive tension. We were very clear when we went out what we were looking for. We want a partner that has the regulatory and pricing experience and an existing infrastructure for sales and marketing. They've got to have a sales force ready to go, because when this gets data, we want to be able to submit and go for marketing as quickly as possible. So having a company that had that skill set was really important. The great thing when you look at those licensing deals that we've done as well, which I think is really important, is that you think of us as a relatively small company in Australia. Most companies in Australia are. But by having these licensing deals, we have exponentially grown our capabilities and our reach. So now we can tap into their commercial teams, their manufacturing teams, their quality teams. We talk to their teams, their clinical teams. We talk to them regularly. And you can almost see that as an extension of our own team now. So our expertise and our capability has exponentially grown.
Goodness me. It's an exciting part of Dimerix's life at the moment in terms of these licensing deals. I'd be interested though, did you attend these negotiations in a position of strength given what you have versus coming cap in hand and saying, would you please distribute our product because we think you might be a good fit?
The short answer is yes, we did go in with a position of strength. Now that position has just got stronger. So if you put that into perspective, the advanced deal that we did back last October was pre that first interim analysis. Now they saw the phase 2 data and they were very comfortable with that. They were pretty confident in what they would expect to see moving forward, which was fantastic. That really did validate the asset commercially. But of course now with the part 1 data out, we have more funding in and we also have that data to support the phase 2. And the reason it's significant is it was in a magnitude bigger cohort for that interim analysis versus the size of the phase 2. And that means that we're now in a much stronger position for that negotiation as well.
Right. They're large numbers, aren't they? 230 million plus royalties. Is a royalty basically based on each administered dose or each sale?
It's usually a monthly pack. So it will be a percentage of the sale of that monthly pack. Now, an example on pricing here, obviously there's nothing approved for FSGS anywhere in the world at the moment, but for another type of rare kidney disease called IgA nephropathy, they had a product approved in the last couple of years, and they are retailing in the US for $10,000 per patient per month, and in Europe for just over $8,000 per patient per month. Now, put that into perspective, with the patient numbers that we're looking at in these, it's a very commercially attractive opportunity of which we could assume similar sort of pricing, and we would then get a percentage of the net sales on that.
How does the end patient afford this?
Now, that is an excellent question, and the short answer is that's not what they pay. Now, you take the US as the key example. US works on what we call a payer system, insurance, and typically your insurance comes through your employer. And the way this works is that you get what's called a tiered reimbursement. Now, typically for orphan drugs, you get what's called tier 2. It means it's the lowest copay. So it means the patient is typically out of pocket only $25 to $35 a month. The rest is paid by insurance. Now then you say, well, why is the insurer happy to pay that? It's cheaper than dialysis.
Aha, that's the answer. Right.
And the same with the other systems. If you look at Europe and Australia with the PBS system, again, when you look at the PBS, you get reimbursement through that. So what you pay at the pharmacy is a fraction of what the actual drug costs.
Yes.
The rest is covered by the government, again, cheaper than dialysis.
Thanks for sharing, Nina. That has just put it all into perspective. And I think we all understand really where you're heading with Dimerix and what your aims are.
I just would like to recognise that it's the team that builds a lot of this. I get to talk today about all of these different things, but really I can't get to talk about all these things unless the team is really pulling together and doing their piece. So I just would acknowledge that it is a team effort.
Yeah, absolutely. External to Dimerix, interesting that with all your background and all your understanding, you do hold 2 non-executive board roles.
Yes.
One with Synthesis Bioventures, which sounds really interesting, a fund focused on early stage therapeutics, investing in projects from discovery, preclinical proof of concept, and IND enabling studies. So what's that about a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a relatively new fund that's been set up, predominantly based in Melbourne at the moment, but looking at assets all over the country. And that is where it's a recognised phenomenon in Australia that we lack VC. Venture capitalists. So quite often in Australia you can get your early seed money, often it's grant, government, university sponsored, or some of the early groups that might take this on. And then you either got to look at listing or you've got a problem in your funding for the next piece. So the problem in Australia is you end up listing too early because you just can't access the capital in any other way. It's not like the US where there's a whole raft of this venture capital that's available. And so what this fund is looking at is trying to plug that gap to be able to get these companies and their assets much further through development before having to look at listing.
Okay. And you enjoying it?
It's a really good opportunity. I'm the chair of that of the board there, so that's a good different exposure for me as well.
And the other one is Linear Clinical Research. You're a non-executive director there, which is clinical trials facility.
That's right, and that's here in Perth. Linear's been around quite a while, and they've got 2 different areas. They've got their healthy volunteer unit, so that's looking at what we talked about before, the phase 1, typically the phase 1 clinical trials where you're trying the product in healthy volunteers predominantly for safety. But they also have a specialty cancer unit as well, so they run a lot of the cancer clinical trials on behalf of the world actually. So there's a lot of overseas companies that come into Perth to do their phase 1, phase 2 studies in cancer trials.
Because it's leading edge?
It's leading edge, yep.
That's very interesting. So this is a sort of a little jewel in the crown in Perth's biotech sector?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's Linear Clinical Research is a not-for-profit. It runs out of Harry Perkins Institute.
Yes, yes. Oh, thanks. It's very good to know. Nina, I'm conscious of time and that sort of thing, but, it's been a fascinating chat, really with regards to the way you've evolved into your career, but then the way you've embraced it. It's been enormous, and your understanding and capability around your craft is very clear and very transparent. It's very easy to tell that you love what you do, but you're also very keen to see it succeed. What are other things that keeps you going? And I know that you've sort of, outside of your skiing and your sport, which I know you've got less time to probably do these days except skiing. What else keeps you going? Husband and kids?
Yeah, it's a pretty big piece. The day for us is pretty busy. Usually I'm doing US calls early in the morning. I'm doing European calls late in the evening. But you know what? That actually works around family life. It means you can take time out at dinner time and sit down as a family and work together. And I'm very fortunate that my husband is very supportive and is self-employed, so he can work around my travel, which is also good.
Oh, fantastic. Tell me, you seem like you've been able to balance get that work-life balance pretty well throughout your career. Have you found it challenging?
And I'd say it's a roller coaster. So there are periods where it is really busy and you have to make sure you take time out to spend that time with the family, and other times where it's far more balanced and steady as she goes. So this industry is always a roller coaster. But overall, and it comes back to the point I think I was making before, that ability to compartmentalize. I don't take the issues home with me. I can say very rarely have I had trouble sleeping.
Well, that's nice.
Yes, it's already apart from when the kids were born, but that's another story.
Oh, look, Nina, as I said to you at the start, we do appreciate the fact that you've taken the time out to join us on your trip to Perth from Melbourne. You've been able to allocate some time to give us a really good insight into your life, and it's been much appreciated. And I would like to say good luck with Dimerix. It's a fascinating story, and on behalf of Euroz Hartleys, by coming on Finding the Front, you've been able to give our listeners some real insight into the biotechnology, biopharmaceutical area, but also a real interesting journey. And yours is just a fantastic one. So thanks again.
No, thank you very much for your time. I've enjoyed it.
Good on you. Thanks, Nina. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Euroz Hartleys Finding the Front. This podcast is for general information purposes only. Please check out eurozhartleys.com for more information. Euroz Hartleys holds Australian Financial Services Licence 230052.